Okay, this screencast is going to continue our chapter 21 notes, so please have that outline open. We're going to continue the narrative of Germany's aggressions in Europe. Where we last left off with that story is that, World War II began when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. We need to go over an important key term here called Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg literally translates to lightning warfare, but it is kind of the style or strategy of fighting that Hitler engages in throughout World War II. It essentially is named Blitzkrieg because it involves a series of surprise attacks that are not, foreseen. These, lightning quick advances into enemy territory that include airstrikes, kind of make the enemy, really feel caught off guard, like a lightning strike. Basically, Hitler would use tanks in combination with, aerial attacks by plane, to destroy enemy forces on the ground, thus kind of, opening up enemy lines to then send in his troops, on the ground, his ground forces that would move in and occupy the area completely. This was a very much offensive kind of tactic compared to what we saw in World War I with trench warfare, which was far more defensive. And the reality is the enemies are not prepared for this, style of fighting because they are used to more of that defensive, style. So because Hitler's able to catch people off guard, he's very successful with his Blitzkrieg advances, and this is how he's able to take countries such as Poland, as well as Norway, Denmark, other smaller, Eastern European countries, for example, the ones we saw on the political cartoon from yesterday. But eventually he's going to turn his attention to a larger country, and that is France to the west. So if you quickly look at this map on the screen, you see that, France and Germany actually border each other. I have my mouse here. They border each other in part. And then the further north you move up the French, border, there are smaller European countries sitting between them. I think France suspected that Germany would likely, target them at the border, at the direct border, just because it's a more direct point of contact for Germany to invade France, who at this point has declared war on Germany, and that's why they would be suspecting an invasion. Hitler kind of knows that that's a likely point of contact. In fact, the French had even built up a defense wall called the Maginot Line to kind of protect that border line. But because Hitler knows that's predicted, he is instead going to attack with Blitzkrieg by cutting through the Ardennes forest, which is, you don't have to know that forest name, but that's in Belgium. So it was a little bit more of an unexpected point of attack, which allows him to move his forces in quickly, once again, successfully using Blitzkrieg. And so give it a few weeks and Paris, the capital city, will fall to German control, which unfortunately means that France as a whole is falling to German control. This actually pushed a large number, thousands of French and British soldiers to the seaside, the shoreline, and the coast in a town called Dunkirk. So this is a pretty good movie that came out in the past few years. I know many of you maybe heard of it. It did star Harry Styles. He was a supporting actor at least. But what the Dunkirk evacuation references, y'all, if we go back to this map really quickly, Hitler kind of pushing easily into France. The soldiers who were fighting to defend the country are literally pushed all the way to the coastline of the English Channel, across which is England itself, Great Britain. And so thousands of combined French and British soldiers waited to be evacuated on the beaches. And it was a rescue evacuation, and it's kind of a sad story because it's a victory for the British, Navy and for volunteer, boatsmen and fishermen who rescued these large numbers of stranded soldiers on the coastline before Germany captured them. But it's sad because France fell, and that's why they're being evacuated from the French coastline. So it's kind of a sad day when France falls to German control. Just some more pictures here. Okay, so next, Hitler is going to turn his attention to England, his other main enemy. Remember that England being the UK, I should say, Great Britain being an island, it's kind of defended naturally by water. Hitler is really forced to attack by air, like with planes, with his air force. And the German Air Force was called the Luftwaffe, which I have that term here. And the British Air Force was called the RAF, or the Royal Air Force. So, for about 2 months in 1940, Hitler's Luftwaffe forces bomb England, like, night after night, day after day. London is just like pounded with bombs, a lot of physical destruction. The reason that England was able to fend off these aerial assaults is because we have a new invention that we did not have in World War I, and that is radar. So the Royal Air Force and the British intelligence are able to detect anytime there was a German attack coming over the English Channel into the UK. Eventually, Hitler has to kind of call off the invasion because he's not getting anywhere. This is kind of where Churchill makes his infamous stand saying, "We will never surrender, we'll never quit." I think, England is kind of the first example, London standing, England standing is kind of the first example of Hitler not succeeding at one of his initiatives. And I think this is where he kind of starts to go a little bit mad, because he later turns his attention to the Soviet Union. Recall that Hitler had a non-aggression pact signed with Stalin. Let's be honest, though, that didn't stop him from invading Germany, so it's certainly not going to stop him from kind of going against this non-aggression pact either. Basically, Hitler will decide to invade the Soviet territory. The second he does that, Stalin joins forces really quickly with Britain and France. Eventually as well, the U.S. once we enter the war, but this is how we kind of come to fight with Stalin. If his enemy is now Hitler, we want to kind of use that to our advantage, right? We have a common enemy now. So the Soviet military was actually fairly successful. The German military was fairly successful making it inwards towards the Soviet Union. You see the capital of Moscow, other important cities being Leningrad and Stalingrad, city of Lenin, city of Stalin, is their translations. But Stalingrad ended up being a major kind of catalyst and turning point for the German initiative in the Soviet Union. They are pretty much held up at Stalingrad. It is a 2-year-long battle. There's some really great movies that focus on this fight, because Stalin and the Soviet military, this is not like he's messing with another democratic republic or anything like that. Yes, Stalin is a communist, but he's also a dictator. So the military, the Soviet military, and their treatment of their own military officers are very brutal. There's a lot of death here, high casualties on all sides. But what the German military was really not prepared for was a Russian winter. Do not invade Russia in the winter is often a kind of joke that stems from this battle. So basically, the German soldiers, after so many years of fighting in a really rough winter, are eventually going to be forced to retreat. So that is a second kind of loss and struggle for Hitler. But the bigger struggle is he has now made a huge enemy of someone east of him. And so now he's fighting a 2-front war, which he had not yet been fighting. He had really only, he had successfully conquered land in the east, but now he has enemies in both the west and the east fighting him actively, and that was a mistake if he wanted his success to continue. I want to quickly touch on what's going on in Africa, which I know is kind of seems bizarre because, it's not in Europe. But just a recollection that, Africa was heavily colonized by many European countries in the 20th century. So if you see this map, it's kind of showing you an outline of like, okay, well, here are regions and nations in Africa that were controlled by the British or by the French or by the Italians, the Soviets, etc. So much like we saw like in the Spanish-American War, the fighting was brought to the Philippines because that was a Spanish colony. In World War II, a lot of the fighting is brought to North Africa. That is also because note that Italy, who is about to have an official alliance but was allied with Germany throughout the course of this war, is really just north of North Africa, just across the Mediterranean Sea. So for the Allies, they see this as potential, like, okay, we need to eventually, like England's, realizing we need to eventually get into mainland Europe to stop Hitler. We could really kind of come through Italy to do that, since Italy is an ally of Hitler. And so that's kind of why there's a lot of fighting happening in North Africa between the Axis, the German and Italian, versus the Allies, the British and French powers. I did want to kind of establish that another kind of turning point during the fight in North Africa is that we will officially have a document signed by Germany, Italy, and Japan, a document called the Tripartite Pact, which officially forms that alliance between those three countries. Again, those are Germany, Italy, and Japan, naming them the Axis powers. And this is the enemy side of the United States and of the other allies during World War II. We'll talk about why Hitler and why Mussolini decided to sign an alliance with an Asian country. I'll give you a hint, it has a lot to do with the United States, but we'll pick up with that tomorrow. But you just want to be aware that that agreement, the Tripartite Pact, is what officially formed the Axis powers. During the fight of North Africa, during the North African campaign, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was quoted as saying that that would be our perfect target to invade Italy, which was considered the quote-unquote soft underbelly of Europe, which was kind of making it sound like Italy was a vulnerable spot to be, kind of invaded, and a likely success if they were to target that. The last thing I want to say really quickly is that FDR is truly supporting the idea of an American involvement in this war more and more throughout the course of all the things we've been discussing today. It kind of becomes to a point where America realizes, in the government anyway, American intervention on behalf of England is probably unavoidable. FDR obviously doesn't want to, encourage or call for an act of war or a declaration of war if, there's not a specific event that would bring America into it. He doesn't want to do anything that would, cost him support, a potential re-election. He wants it to be something that majority of Americans would support. He does start giving these speeches referring to the United States as needing to be the great arsenal of democracy, meaning that we would need to kind of weaponize and provide the weapons and resources to fight this war at the very least. If we're going to do anything, we have to use our resources to help fight for democracy in Europe by opposing, the Third Reich and the Axis powers. We also begin to provide Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union, just like we were with Britain. And that's because Stalin and the Soviets are now also fighting Hitler, so we want to provide them with that same resource. Okay, we'll continue and wrap up this chapter tomorrow, but please just pause and write down any questions you may have, and we can discuss tomorrow.